For him to come up. Let me begin by introducing myself. I'm Ian Wallace. I'm a senior fellow in the GMF Digital, and I want to welcome you to our first webinar of 2021. And a very timely topic it is too. We've been planning an event on building a trusted ICT supply chain pretty much since the Solarium Commission published their white paper on building a trusted ICT supply chain back in October of last year. But since then, we've had the revelations about the SolarWinds hack, and that is indeed just the half of it, as we'll see as the conversation goes on. So we have plenty to discuss and a fantastic group of people to discuss it with. We're going to have this conversation in two parts. To begin with, I'm going to talk to Chris Inglis, who, as well as teaching at the Naval Academy at Annapolis and having previously been a deputy director of the National Security Agency, is also a commissioner on the Solarium Commission, and as such, one of the people behind the 5 key recommendations and 8 supporting recommendations in this report. After I've spoken to Chris for 20 minutes or so, we're going to switch and bring in Rob Morgus from the Commission staff and my GMF colleagues, Lindsay, Gorman, and Sam duPont for a more detailed discussion. Chris, just to kick off, let me congratulate you on getting an enormous number of Solarium recommendations into law through the recent NDAA, which I think sort of speaks to the opportunity in this work. But narrowing in specifically on the topic of the day, building trust in the ICT supply chain. SolariumWinds has clearly given us a sense of just how important this is, if we needed reminding, given several years of discussing particularly sort of 5G and other topics. But I think it'd be really helpful if you could just outline what it is that you are setting out to address with this white paper and these recommendations. What's the challenge as the Commission sees it, and where do you think the challenges take us?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the venue and for an impressive group that'll, I think, complement any discussion that we can have. Special shout out to Rob Morgus, who was the principal author of the paper that Solarium wrote on this topic. Delighted that he's aboard and that I think he's going to add a lot of value to the conversation. I think, like you, it's hard not to stare in the immediate past at SolarWinds and say, you know, this is a crisis. This is something that's been building over time, and we should do something about that. But in my view, and I suspect in the view of the Commission, that's the thunderstorm. Climate change is what we've seen in terms of our competition and unfair competition with China. And we therefore need to keep our eye on both of those dynamics. Essentially, 3 things have framed the Solarium Commission's view of the trustworthiness of the supply chain. The first is that we observe, not just for the United States, but for its allies, a significant strategic weakness of our dependence on raw materials that are essential to critical functions, not simply defense, but life critical functions within our societies. Raw materials, intermediate goods, finished products, we no longer produce those, source those, fabricate those in the quantities necessary to ensure that we can rely upon the critical functions dependent upon those through thick and thin. The second is, regardless of the source of those components or raw material, there's a concern about the trustworthiness as they arrive onshore, as they arrive in our custody and they're placed into operations. Now, within the report that we wrote, we described a particular threat that if those products and services are sourced from overseas, that's a physical opportunity for mischief. But I think that SolarWinds reminds, it doesn't matter where they come from. If you don't guard the provenance of the supply chain, you could be at significant risk. That an adversary that finds an open supply chain can access that and corrupt that, regardless of whether it's in your garrison or whether it's abroad. And the third, not independent of the first two observation that Solarium made, was that there's a failure of competitiveness and innovation, which ultimately results in an economic insecurity. Now, some of that we can attribute in the case of China. That's again my analogy of that's climate change, to forced technology transfer because of their trade practices, because of intellectual property theft, because of their all-on approach to standards where the US and others have perhaps backed up. And the failure of the US to invest in those fundamentals of the design, fabrication, and delivery of the materials that are in our critical systems. Having commoditized a lot of that, we're now reaping the wind in terms of the dependence we have on sources that might not strategically or tactically be trustworthy. And so the Solarium Commission, having observed that, not briefly, but in the context of a lot of other things, in a very modest way, and a recommendation said we need to get serious about the supply chain, then kind of produced one of the white papers on the supply chain that you've referenced in your remarks, and we'll talk about that at some length today.
Thank you. And given that problem set, then, what were the principles that underpinned the recommendations that you've come out with?
Well, first, recognizing that in the absence of strategy, nothing can be strategic. Right up front, we said that you have to identify what the key technologies and the equipment, the manifestations of those technologies. We don't know that we've done that well enough. Consistent with that, you also have to identify what you think the threats to that are. And while there are many sources of information on that, they're not consolidated and focused in a way that if you were going to make an investment in this, or if you're going to double down on trying to reshore this, not necessarily onshore this, that you know what threats are more important than others. And so you have to figure out, kind of the data that underpins this and the strategy that guides your efforts. Second, once you've established that, you have to establish a minimum viable manufacturing capability. That's different than saying we have to onshore everything. That's unrealistic. You can't do that. But you have to figure out what you reasonably should reshore so that you have confidence in the result. Confidence that it can reasonably supply that under all economic conditions, under all geopolitical conditions, and that you could defend it when it's at risk, and it's never going to be absent of risk. Third, you need to then, once those supply chains are set in motion, you can't assume that they defend themselves. You need to actually defend them. That's a human proposition. I think that's the principal failure that we're observing in SolarWinds. It wasn't that it was inherently kind of flawed by design. Maybe we'll find some flaws by design, but the supply chain that SolarWinds used to get software to its customers is very much like what Apple uses or Google uses to get software apps to the customers who have smartphones. And so if there's a fundamental flaw in the design of that, we ought to all be very afraid. But I don't think there is. It's the failure to defend it. That's the third big principle. Fourth, given the economic insecurities we observed, we need to stimulate a domestic market. We think market forces ultimately should prevail, but they could use some assistance. And so there are some recommendations that say, how do you actually jumpstart that? How do you actually provide not just public money, but private public money, and through a mixture of incentives and perhaps the allocation of things like bandwidth. And then fifth, this has to succeed or it will fail in an international context. And so while we want to establish global competitiveness, that's not a US only strategy. It has to be US in the context with allies, like-minded nations, such that when we reshore as opposed to onshore, we're thinking in the broadest possible context of what the security conditions would be that we and our allies establish that then sustain us, not just the small us.
Perhaps that's a good area to sort of dig into in a bit more detail. One of the things that very clearly comes out of the white paper is this idea that working with trusted allies is the path to a more reliable, more trusted supply chain. What in a little bit more detail do you think are the opportunities to build those stronger relationships, and where might there be a different emphasis, do you think, going forward than we've had in the last few years?
Yeah, so we established some attributes that might ultimately be ascribed to what we think is a trustworthy supply chain, or a trustworthy set of partnerships that underpin the supply chain. They're not as objective as you might like. It's not like a checklist, but these are simply questions that you have to ask. You have to ask yourself, since at the end of the day, the principal deficiency that we face at the moment is that the Chinese, the PRC, has stolen the march on us. What is ultimately, if you establish a supply chain, the weakness or the strength of the Chinese kind of competitor, the stream standing alongside you? And you have to always consider that this is not a game where we operate alone, unimpeded. And so you have to think about what the Chinese strategic objectives are, what their moves are, and make sure that stride for stride, that we're putting things that, using our market forces and using our principles, will in fact prevail. Two, you do have to think about then the impact of geography. If you're going to have a supply chain that's extended, say in the case of the United States, broadly across the Pacific, and there are certain geopolitical conditions under which you think that's at risk, you need to make sure that you have some options, or at least some cul-de-sacs, that you can perhaps mitigate those risks by use of geography that is more favorable to your conditions. Third, you need to think about geopolitical stability. We're not completely uncomfortable having the reliance on Taiwan that we do today, but you can imagine that the stability of the current situation is uncertain at best. And you need to think in the longer term about the stability of that relationship. You can say, I would say this without speaking for the US government or Solarium at large, we have high confidence on the stability of our relationships with South Korea or Japan, or kind of the NATO and Five Eyes partners. And so that factors in as well. And then ultimately, your ability to establish trustworthiness is attributable not simply to technologies or the source of those technologies, but to the overlay of your operational, your monitoring of that, the things you do to actually defend that, as you take this from theory to practice, and you're actually trying to figure out, as this system develops and delivers capability to you, do you understand how that supply chain is being used, whether it's in fact still intact? It never will be completely intact. And are you able to then establish maneuver and agility inside that supply chain? If you do all of those things, then I think you're in a place where you say, I can reasonably establish some confidence in my supply chain. And I go back to a point I made in my earlier remarks, which is that all has to be based on data. If you don't know what your data is that supports that, then you're going to be operating without some North Star. And that's a very dangerous place to be.
Where does that data come from? I mean, what do we need to do in order to make sure that we have that data that we can build our strategy on the back of?
Some of the data is easily obtained, where you simply go out and you look at the requirements of your critical systems and the technologies and functions that they depend upon. And that's a question of aggregation and synthesis, and it can be developed in a relatively straightforward manner, but it needs to be done with a focus that you're going to synthesize that and come to some perhaps organized observations, as opposed to letting market forces alone drive you, which is an inherently distributed activity, and it doesn't give you any central thesis. Two, there are, especially with respect to knowledge of other nations' activities and the threats that they might constitute, either in their positive actions or in their diminution or degradation of your efforts, intelligence comes to bear. And there therefore needs to be some intelligence efforts. They're best done in an international coalition and using both private and public sources, but intelligence needs to be brought to bear. It can perhaps discern those things that are only teased out of dark or kind of shaded corners. And in that regard, we have some specific recommendations about the US intelligence community working in an international context to derive and put into play information that will give us a solid foundation for how we describe our strategy and then understand how that's working. There are any number of other ways to perhaps derive that intelligence, but those are two broad ones. It's got to, at the end of the day, have a life force that centralizes it, and it's got to use all the instruments of power available to us, which are not simply observable, but they might have to use some exquisite instruments of government power, best done in an international context.
So just sort of coming back on that specific sort of idea that this is a strategic approach, and I think this is where this sort of builds off the back of the main Solarium report, which very clearly set a sort of strategic direction. As you know better than most, the key to effective strategy is sort of aligning ends, ways, means. How do you think? What do you see as the sort of key priorities to make sure that the strategy fits the resources and the strategic situation that we find ourselves in?
I'll cheat a little bit in so much as the report itself, as you indicated earlier, had 5 major recommendations, 8 supporting recommendations. I'll just mention briefly the 5 overarching recommendations, because I still think that those constitute a reasonable framework. And while they're put in the context of a US strategy, again, this must be done in an international context. And so this is something that should be done with like-minded nations. So first is you have to kind of develop a strategy. I just leave that as period, full stop. You've got to figure out what your aspirations are such that those ends then can be reconciled to the ways and means. 2, you have to actually identify what the key technologies are that support that strategy. And so the Congress, we believe, within the United States, has a reasonable set of powers to direct the Department of Homeland Security, working with Commerce, Defense, State, to identify what those key technologies are such that we can then figure out the threads, right? You begin to then identify the means. Third, the Congress should direct kind of the exploration of some onshoring or reshoring, which would focus on 2 things. One, how do you kind of create some manufacturing centers? We recommend 3 to 5, but at the same time, some research and development activity that would then continue to inform that, or if not juice that, kind of fuel that. So we kind of recommend, for example, studying the viability of public-private kind of capital investment firms that might stand up with market forces in mind, but with a government kickstart, right, to try to create those economic zones that are reshored in research and development alongside. Fourth, with respect to kind of making sure that there's a centralized life force, we believe that there should be a designated lead agency that is accountable for informing that with the intelligence that comes from many places, according to your previous question. But to ensure that once we've got that strategy, that we have some assessments on underway and intelligence to support that tell us that we're in the right place. And then 5th, because it's the kind of technology of the moment, is to tie 5G infrastructure investment to this such that we can use that perhaps as real work that will help us transform our approach to critical kind of structure, infrastructure as we go forward. There's an old saw that I love, which is, kind of use real work to effect a transformation. And if it's in crisis, all the better, because that constitutes the burning platform that people will use to unify their efforts.
So that brings me to my final question. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Solarium Commission has been extraordinarily successful in getting its ideas into law, but we're going to have a very busy Congress and a president who has many other priorities going forward. So just to sort of cap this off, as a member of the Commission, what is your plea to the incoming administration and members of Congress as to why this is something that they should make one of their priorities over the next year or so?
I don't think it's going to take much convincing to the oncoming administration that this is a priority. The question is, where does it sit amongst 5 strategic priorities, right? So we have any number at the moment: the pandemic and kind of the perception of social injustice and economic equality. Those are all real problems, and our finances are going to ultimately be in question if we try to spend our way out of this. But the incoming administration has already indicated it's serious about this. The incoming administration is likely to have a cyber coordinator and a national cyber director, and it's indicated that it intends to put strength of leadership, function, and resources into CISA, right, the Cyber Infrastructure and Security Agency, such that I think it's going to be serious about this. My recommendations to the incoming administration would be threefold. One, take advantage of the momentum that comes out of the Trump administration. For all of the challenges we've had over the last 4 years, I think that you could say that under the Trump administration, or those 4 years, we had a Solarium Commission. It was bipartisan, nonpartisan. It recommended an excellent set, with no kind of false modesty implied, or an excellent set of perhaps starting recommendations, 80 in all, 27 of which, or 25 of which have shown up in 27 kind of legislative actions inside the National Defense Authorization Act, and the most important of which is establishing ongoing, enduring cyber leadership in the National Cyber Director. Use that, take that, kind of draft on that. Two, take advantage of the executive action that's already been established. If there was a principle that you saw time and again in the Trump administration, it was to exercise executive action. Now, sometimes in a US only modality, sometimes in a narrowly threaded modality, kind of unleashing US Cyber Command for persistent engagement in forward defense in a defensive mechanism, I think is meritorious so long as it's used in the context intended, which is for defense, right, and modulated by necessity and proportionality. But use the other instruments of power alongside that. Executive action also should include financial remedies. It should include diplomacy. It should include statecraft that simply uses the public rhetoric. All of those done in an international context can take advantage of the proclivity of the US government, hopefully along like-minded nations, to finally make a difference that matters, that endures. And then third, I would say it's not a trivial undertaking that the Commerce Department under Ajit Pai has done some really notable things with respect to 5G. Again, that can be a kind of problem of the moment that you use to draft and perhaps transform our efforts in the longer term. And I would be kind of, perhaps I think, forgiven if I simply say that while I do believe that SolarWinds is a thunderstorm and we should be focused on climate change, I would still use it because everyone is electrified by it and say that is an exemplar of what could happen to us writ large if we don't get serious about this. I am optimistic about where we are. I'm more optimistic about where we could go if we take advantage of some of these recommendations.
Chris, thank you very much. That was a fantastic overview, and I think sets us up very well for our further conversation. So I'm going to now ask Lindsay Gorman, Rob Morgus, and Sam duPont to come in, and we'll dig into some of the detailed recommendations. But thank you very much, Chris, for that overview, and good luck with the Commission's work going forward.
Thank you.
Rob, as Chris mentioned, you were one of the authors of this white paper, having contributed key parts to the Solarium's main report earlier in the year. What were the sort of key novel elements that the Commission felt were important, and particularly with regard to the sort of international dimension that Chris spoke about, and the idea of sort of, you know, public-private, which I think was an interesting part of the report. Where do you see the opportunities going forward there?
Thanks, Ian. And Chris and his thoughtfulness is always a difficult act to follow, but I'll do my best. I think Chris touched on a lot of the good recommendations, and I would just focus on sort of 2.5 buckets to sort of in answer to your direct question there, Ian. The first is a set of recommendations that asks us to take a close look at the authorities, capacities, and capabilities of different instruments of national power or sort of national investment power, thinking specifically about things like the Export-Import Bank, the Defense or the Development Finance Corporation, and the Trade Development Agency, each of whom play an important role in supporting American businesses in foreign markets. Significantly, a number of countries, including our primary competitor in this space, or sort of in the space of question, which is obviously China, employ their export credit agencies to further geopolitical aspirations. China's among the most aggressive in this regard. I would say we are learning to be more aggressive and slowly working towards being a little bit more aggressive in this space. And just sort of by way of background, I think it's useful to understand what EXIM, what DFC, and what USTDA do, and then we can sort of talk a little bit about why we need to sort of plus up some aspects of what they do. So EXIM assists American businesses in exporting their goods to customers by providing financial assistance in the form of loans, of loan guarantees, and oftentimes in the form of insurance. They fill a gap in private export financing to help bolster U.S. business. The DFC, which was formed in December 2019, consolidated the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, and the USAID's credit authority or credit agency. They provide equity financing, debt financing, political risk insurance, and technical development assistance to U.S. businesses overseas. And then the U.S. TDA helps companies create U.S. jobs through the export of U.S. goods and services for priority development projects in emerging economies. Each of these agencies could be valuable tools in supporting U.S. and partner companies overseas, but have challenges with regard to their funding environments and the sort of programmatics that they're able to run because of some authorities issues and jurisdiction issues. For example, some of them have questions and ambiguous authorities about whether they're able to support investments from companies headquartered in partner and ally countries. This is particularly pertinent in the context of, if we want to talk about sort of telecommunications equipment, where the United States doesn't have a telecommunications champion, especially when we talk about sort of 5G or next generation telecommunications. We need to look to Nokia, we need to look to Ericsson, we need to look to Samsung. If we can't support Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung, we can't support our de facto champions in this space. In December, not of last year, I think in 2019 as well, Congress passed an act that created a China program at Exim. And that program needs to be supported, but we need to take a hard look at the authorities available to both Exim, DFC, and TDA to sort of do better work, not only in emerging economies, but in sort of middle income countries, and to support partner and ally companies. The second major bucket I'd point to is more squarely looking at the development community and the way that aid money is spent. A couple of different sort of recommendations that are thrown out there by the commission. One is for this notion of a digital risk impact assessment, which is something that I've actually worked on in the past with you, Ian. But it's this idea that we need to provide the development community with better tools to understand the risks that they're opening their constituents up to. And they will therefore make smarter decisions based on that risk impact assessment. And the idea behind that is, if we know that Huawei's ZTE and sort of Chinese competitor equipment is inherently more vulnerable, is potentially more risky because we have evidence that they're sending data back to Beijing, for example, that should be folded into the calculus when development projects are investing in infrastructure on the ground. The second major recommendation that we have there pertains directly to US aid money, and that is the notion that we need to have essentially either a whitelist or a blacklist for what that money is allowed to be spent on. Most of the time, aid projects right now have sort of on an ad hoc basis these same blacklists. What we're saying is we need to institutionalize that, and the folks that would go on that blacklist are the ones that many would sort of immediately think of, and I've already mentioned, likes of Huawei and ZTE, just to make sure that US taxpayer dollars aren't going towards supporting competitor industries. And then the final sort of piece of the equation, and I think you mentioned it briefly, Ian, is this notion of private investment. And this is where I think, the US needs to get creative. Unlike China, I don't think the US government is going to foot the entire bill for what we're talking about here, whether it's sort of reinvigorating American manufacturing or ensuring competitiveness in global markets, right? We're not a command economy. We're not going to, it's going to be difficult politically to reconcile the need for that level of investment, because we're not talking about millions. We're probably not even talking about billions. We're probably talking about trillions of dollars of investment here. And while the US government possesses considerable financial power, the scale of investment needed to sort of plug these gaps is probably beyond what they have. So the commission recommends, and Chris touched on this briefly in his comments, recommends the creation of something that we call sort of in lowercase a National Security Investment Corporation. And the goal for this type of organization would be to essentially serve as a clearinghouse to connect private investments to investment opportunities that we know are in the national security interest. In many cases, as we understand it, it's an issue of information and knowledge about these investments. And if there was more knowledge in the institutional investor space, many of them would actually gravitate to these types of investments. In some cases, though, that might not be enough. And that's why we need to look into tools that we can endow this organization with to potentially provide a little bit more incentive to invest in these critical areas, which could include things like creating semiconductor fabrication capability in the United States or in partner countries. It could include things like broadband and telecommunications investment in third-party countries. And some of the tools that we think we need to look at are things like government loan guarantees, government return on investment guarantees, and the like. And the sort of insight there, or the benefit there, as I see it at least, is that even if some of the investments identified and run through this clearinghouse fail from a private investment standpoint, you're looking at the US government footing a smaller portion of the bill rather than the entire bill. And I think there's some serious value to be had in that.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic overview, and I think there's definitely stuff there that we can dig into in discussion. But one of the key themes that ran through that, I think, is the opportunity, the necessity, even for the government to work with and even through private sector companies, and indeed sort of engage in the global economy in order to create the conditions for a trusted supply chain. And with that thought in mind, I want to bring in Lindsay Gorman, who is the Emerging Technologies Fellow with the Alliance for Securing Democracies at GMF, who's someone who's done a lot of work, amongst other things, on the role of standards bodies, which is something else that is picked up by the Solarium Commission. And key to this theme. Lindsay, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about why you think standards bodies are important, and how you see the sort of recommendations of the Commission and work that you've done changing the way in which the sort of US engages in that particular space?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ian, for the invitation to appear here today, and great to see you, Rob and Sam, as well. I guess I'd like to sort of step back from the standards bodies question for just a second, if you'll permit me to sort of situate it in a context of not only the supply chain, but some of the key technologies that Chris referred to in his initial remarks. And I think, he identified 5G as, I would say, almost sort of a test case or a poster child through which some of these issues have been raised and have been drawn attention to. I sort of conceive the 5G conversation as slightly broader, and this is where the standards bodies come into it as well, as really thinking about defining the architecture of the future internet. And so part of that is the 5G infrastructure. I think of it in sort of three layers. The one is that 5G infrastructure layer. So the pipes, if you will, the radio access network vendors where the United States does not have a leading champion. Then the second layer is really the application layer. What applications are being built on top of that infrastructure? Why do we really care about leading in 5G infrastructure? Part of it is so we can avoid a SolarWinds scenario and have backdoors implanted into our communications networks, potentially from authoritarian actors. But another part of it is that whoever builds the infrastructure that this new internet of applications is going to be based on is going to have a de facto advantage in developing these applications. And unfortunately, we're already seeing that to be the case in cases of Huawei and ZTE, particularly in the context of the developing world, which I'll get to more in a second. And so then that third layer really is the standards and governance dimension. And as I argue in one of the recent papers that Ian may have alluded to in the introduction, is that these three layers really are inextricably connected. And in fact, competitiveness at all three layers impacts competitiveness at each of the others. And so the standards bodies component of this, these are technical organizations and designed to be technocratic organizations where engineers from different companies come together to discuss patents and discuss which patents in particular from which companies will be included in a global standard. And why that matters is if you're going to implement a system, you need sort of everyone to be on the same page about which connector fits into which part. And so that's, I think, sort of a rudimentary analogy for what these guys are doing, and hopefully girls too, when they're setting standards on when it comes to 5G and even the generations to follow in the telecommunications and internet space. And right now, the United States has taken a very bottom-up approach to competing at these standards organizations and to getting their patents into the global standard. Namely, that's been private sector driven, where individual companies, the Qualcomms, the Microsofts, etc., of course, have an interest in getting their patents into the global standard, because that means that whenever someone implements the standard, then you have to pay royalties to the company whose patent is in the standard. So there's an incredible advantage to getting your patents in the standard. And the United States has succeeded until recently, really, in this sort of bottom-up innovation approach that I think typifies all three layers of the future internet and much of our innovation enterprise. By contrast, China has taken the opposite approach, the top-down approach, whereby the Chinese Communist Party sets some goals for competitiveness in standardization. And in fact, there have been cases of sort of block voting and block alignment amongst the companies that participate at these standards organizations to promote particular standards. And why I think this is important in the supply chain and the application layer and the infrastructure context is not only has the standards bodies been a place where Huawei and ZTE have been able to promote their infrastructural dominance, but right now what we're seeing is that they're also shaping standards of applications. And this really has sort of the national security and democracy and human rights concerns at its core, because these application layer technologies that are being built atop 5G infrastructure, things like facial recognition systems, like smart streetlights that, could know when Lindsay Gorman's walking down the street, I'm going to show her on this street light, this advertisement, whether it's a political advertisement or a commercial advertisement. These information platforms are being built into the Internet of Things and the Internet of Everything on top of this infrastructure. And so just to give one recent example from the International Telecommunications Union, which is one of the standardization bodies at which this competition is taking place, one standard for this smart street light that has been promoted by ZTE sort of aligns very closely with the ZTE smart street light model and includes things like video monitoring and includes advertisement and information platforms baked in. Another example is at these standardization bodies, the future of vehicular multimedia is being considered. So what that means is we're thinking a lot about autonomous cars, and that's one of the innovations that 5G is really going to enable. Well, what does that mean for the information environment? In this vehicular multimedia group, as part of the International Telecommunications Union, they're trying to standardize sort of a communications platform, an information platform that when you're driving your autonomous car, you don't have to pay attention to the wheel, you'll be watching something. And so why do we really care about competitiveness in these information platforms that get built in? It's because this contest between democracies and autocracies is really taking place in the information environment, and the information models that get built into these technologies. I don't know exactly what that autonomous vehicle is going to be showing you as you drive, but it's probably not going to show you when you pass Tiananmen Square. It's probably not going to show you a detailed history. And so at the application layer, these technologies are really shaping our realities, as I think we're becoming all too familiar with now. But as another example, one of Huawei's application layer technologies for the future internet is actually a smart tourism service that will, presumably provide information about touristic landmarks. And these technologies are, to pick up on the point about our strategy in the developing world, they're really being exported not only in some developed countries, but really primarily in the developing world, where they're able to shape the information architectures and really the values that underline those architectures, whether that's through these smart tourism initiatives or more concerningly in predictive policing, where facial recognition systems and smart city architecture is being used to, in the words of one Brazilian official, anticipate crime and make preventative arrests before the crime happens. And so for all of the United States national security establishment's efforts to promote democracy around the world, we seem to have sort of a gap when it comes to how technology is mediating values that go counter to our own. So I would love to see sort of more development initiatives that better align our geopolitical goals and our values with our investment. And I think that's some of that is what the Solarium Commission is trying to do. But so to go full circle to your question, Ian, I think the standards piece of this is really that it's a double-edged sword. If you're competitive in standards, then your technology is going to succeed elsewhere around the world. Similarly, if you've already implemented the technology around the world, you're going to have more support from for that standard. And so China has done that at some of these fora and leverage this sort of two-pronged strategy of facts on the ground technology implementation and sort of high-level theoretical technical standards development work in a way that I think right now democracies have not sought to integrate them as closely.
Thank you. There's enormous amount to chew on there, and we'll come back to some of those themes in a moment. But I also want to bring in my colleague, Sam duPont, who is the Deputy Director of GMF Digital, but also in a past life had the digital trade portfolio at USTR. Sam, one of the themes that comes out of the Solarium Commission's report is the sort of US engaging more actively in the economy, in the global economy, in order to give this sort of trusted supply chain that Chris was talking about initially. That clearly has implications for trade, and one of the questions that flows from that, I guess, is, to what extent can we have this added security and these national security concerns and do so in a way that doesn't lead to protectionism and cutting against some of the free trade principles that we assume are going to be important for the US going forward.
Yeah, thanks Ian for the question. Congrats to Rob and to Chris on another excellent report. The good news is that this is not a new problem. That we have trade and national security are often in tension, and that has been true for as long as there has been trade. This is why we have export controls, for example, to prevent sensitive technology to going to countries that we don't trust. Likewise, this is why we have CFIUS in the United States, the Committee on Foreign Investment that reviews foreign mergers and acquisitions and other investments to evaluate whether they present concerns for national security. From a big picture perspective, the United States economy has been built on openness. And the free flow of goods and the free flow of capital have been major drivers of economic growth and prosperity in the United States for the past 75 years. But the US government has throughout that time navigated challenges where you find tension between free trade and national security. With respect to supply chains in particular, as the report said, and as others have said in different ways, we have a China problem. Supply chains have globalized a great deal over the past 30 years. China plays a pivotal role in a lot of supply chains, including with regard to ICT products. ICT products are themselves heavily traded. The United States is a big importer, but these products are, number one, essential for certain national security functions, and there's reason to believe that China might interrupt our supply of these technologies, and especially in a crisis. And number two, these products are remotely corruptible. When we import a container full of board games, we can inspect those board games at a port, and provided that there's nothing hazardous inside the boxes, we let that container through, and then the US government's job is done. With regard to products that can be accessed and corrupted remotely, the security problems extend even after those products have come across the border. And so that's another area, that's another way in which these products present concerns that are different from other tradable goods. So, in general, you won't be surprised to hear the trade guys say that we should continue to default to openness wherever we can, but where there are risks presented by specific imports, there's every reason to intervene, and our trade commitments allow us to do so. It's just important that those interventions be narrow and be targeted. And to go back to the example of CFIUS and export controls, those interventions have been successful over the years and have allowed continued economic growth, even as they have sort of provided for narrow intervention in the economy, because they have been narrow, because they've been targeted, and because they've been tailored to specific risks. And so glad to go into greater depth in any of this, of course, but I think that as a sort of big principle to keep in mind as we think about the security of supply chains and the tension that national security sometimes finds itself in with regard to international trade is to be open where you can and to be targeted where you have to intervene.
Thank you for that, and we can dig into some of these themes in the time that we have available. But we do have our Q&A, our questions function open. If people have questions, please put them in the chat and include them. And we absolutely have more than enough questions sparking in my mind to keep us going for the time that we have available, and we have Chris joining us to answer some of those. Just the first question that we have up that I want to bring attention to is from Tim Starks, who's asking, is there anything in the Commission report that can be directly related to SolarWinds? You know, quite a lot of the discussion we've had so far really focus on, I think it's fair to say, you know, the China problem that various different people have described. SolarWinds, clearly a Russia problem, or certainly seems to be that way. Chris, Rob, which bits of the white paper would you point to when people on the Hill or in the administration say, you know, which are the things that can help us with the SolarWinds issue?
Well, honestly, the kind of Commission did not specifically anticipate SolarWinds and did not therefore call it out by name, but it did actually address the problem of supply chains, and therefore said that we need to give this a strategic priority, for which we have to have leadership, a strategy, and resources, and a private-public partnership in an international context. So I think to that degree, I can claim that we addressed the general problem and went further, which is to not simply say, how do we shore up, no pun intended, our supply chains, but how do we actually meaningfully defend them, and how do we impose consequences on those who would hold those at risk? Solarium Commission has all of that in there, and therefore I think it remains a blueprint that can be useful as a start. Rob?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you know, one of the things that SolarWinds has taught us from a supply chains perspective is that onshoring does not equate to nullifying all the risk, right? That is one way to address one of the risks that we talk about in the paper. We talk about the risk of, you know, lack of availability of components of finished products. Onshoring helps address that risk. It doesn't go all the way to addressing the trustworthiness risk, which is something Chris talked about and something we do need, you know, to spend a little bit more time and work on. I also think sort of blowing the aperture up a little bit wider from the Solarium perspective, when we talk about SolarWinds, there are two particular recommendations that aren't really supply chain recommendations, but that pop front of mind when I think about SolarWinds. One is the notion of the need for a cyber state of distress declaration for DHS. Basically, when I look at the SolarWinds response, I think it's laid bare the fact that the federal government, especially in the civilian side, is maybe a little bit under-resourced and a little bit underwhelming in its ability to identify, detect, respond, and mitigate sort of systemic attacks. I think that's something that SolarWinds has made somewhat clear. You know, the remedy to us, you know, there are a few remedies. One is to improve the state of CISA and its sort of operational capability. And we've made some progress on that in the NDAA. Another big one is to ensure that CISA has the ability to unlock defense support to civil authorities when we're in a state of distress, and basically plus up its response and recovery capabilities by unlocking standby contracts with industry, having money to reimburse, like I said, defense, whether it's Cybercom or NSA operators, to go under the DHS banner and support in incident response and recovery. And then the other piece that I would point to is the cloud security aspect of this. And we do talk a little bit in the report about the need to drive folks towards better managed service providers, and that includes cloud service providers. When we think about security, it's not necessarily front of mind when folks are thinking about what IaaS or PaaS service they're going to purchase, and that's something that we need to sort of push back into the fore.
I want to come back to the sort of cross-governmental coordination of some of this, but just before I do, Rob, you touched upon something that Evelyn Farkas asked about, is how important is it to, particularly on the hardware side, to mitigate some of the risk by onshoring manufacturing capability, and to what extent do you feel that is an important part of this? And to what extent, as you said, is it actually only part of the solution?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about helping the private sector manage their supply chain risk, the government needs to focus on what it can do well. And I think that there are a few things the government can do well in this space. One, provide better information, better intelligence. So one of the recommendations that we haven't talked about, but is in the supply chain report, is the need for basically national supply chain intelligence group within the intelligence community that not only focuses on ensuring that the products and services that the government's buying are sort of free of supply chain compromise, but also is able to share intelligence out into the private sector, which is something we struggle with, not only in the supply chain context, but in the broader sort of cyber threat context. And it's something that DNI is working through right now. I also think one area that the US is a little bit understaffed or underwhelming right now, and I look to some of our European brothers on this one, is in sort of institutionalized ability to test and verify equipment that comes into the country. The Huawei testing center in the UK has come under some critique, and I think some of it's valid, but I think the overarching concept of needing robust testing capability for stuff that we're bringing to the country it's still valid, it's still there. So we have a few recommendations, both from our initial report and from the supply chain white paper, that really focus on ensuring that we have that national capacity to test not only sort of industrial control systems, but also things like telecommunications equipment, and also sort of looking at the role that a testing center could play in ensuring that open source code is managed well, and that we're addressing vulnerabilities when they pop up there.
Thank you. I think this is going to have to be our penultimate question, but one of the things you alluded to, and Chris mentioned it in his comments, was the fact that any response has to be a whole of government, even whole of nation response. What we begin to get into with this report is areas that are traditionally outside of the remit of even national security experts, but certainly people who traditionally spend their time focused on cybersecurity. I wonder if Sam, Lindsay, even Chris have thoughts on how effective the US government can be, and how changes that have been made recently could mean that things like trade and standards get incorporated into a fully effective national security response, and what additional measures maybe need to be made in that regard.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in, and also curious to hear what the others have to say. But I think I share some of Chris's initial optimism that I actually do think that not only is there a lot the United States government can do, but that there's actually a lot of appetite to do something, particularly in the wake of SolarWinds, but even kind of in the events of the last couple of years leading up to that. I think that's one of the reasons the Solarium Commission was formed initially. Specifically on, what else can the United States government do, going sort of to this point about hardware and software, and, what needs to be domestic, or I would actually also extend that to be from a group of democratic partner countries where there's a relationship of trust, and, what may be outsourced from outside of that. Generally, the smarter the equipment, the more remotely accessible it is, the dumber the equipment, the more you can build sort of a zero trust architecture to safeguard your data. And I mean, ultimately, this is about data. and this is about what you're trying to secure. So I do hope that these digital risk strategies come to answer that question a little bit. I think, one thing to sort of bring the international context in again, since we are GMF, where some of our allies and partners are actually a little bit ahead of the United States, really is in sort of this end-to-end cybersecurity risk assessment of infrastructure. And particularly in the 5G case, we saw that, even though many of our European allies and partners were still using Huawei equipment, because they were using this equipment, they had built up, and part of that is the UK's cybersecurity center. They had built up sort of mitigation steps and risk assessments to quantify and qualify how the risk of choosing an untrusted vendor fit in to the broader spectrum of cybersecurity risks in their telecommunications architecture. Now, I'm never going to stand here and advocate for choosing an untrusted vendor. I think it has to be sort of both and, but something that the United States hasn't really done enough of is we're actually building out those end-to-end cybersecurity risks. We've just said, let's exclude Chinese vendors, and I think that's right, but let's not give enough attention to the other vulnerabilities. And the big problem with untrusted vendors in the supply chain is that the entire cybersecurity industry is built on finding and patching vulnerabilities. Now, of course, it's a lot easier to find and exploit a vulnerability when you introduce that vulnerability into the system. So what we've been trying to do is not allow those companies from countries that have an active interest in collecting data and intelligence on US persons, not allow them that sort of leg up in being able to introduce a vulnerability into their own systems. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't still hundreds, thousands, millions of vulnerabilities that can be found in the wild. So I think, coming up with a more detailed risk assessment of the vulnerabilities that, cannot be introduced maliciously, but are the product of the fact that humans write software, needs to be a part of a more secure supply chain. And I think that's an area that not only can the United States learn from its allies and partners, but also work together to figure out what can be part of this allied manufacturing base, and what doesn't need to be. Thank you.
Go ahead. Someone else have anything to...
I recognize we're running out of time here, but I'll maybe add one other thought. As we think about how to, the report talks about ways to incentivize the creation of trusted supply chains, and in this regard, trade can be a positive tool that we can use. One of the ways that we have created supply chains in the past is through the conclusion of trade agreements and investment agreements with partner countries. NAFTA, for example, helped create by zeroing out tariffs on auto parts and finished automobiles, helped create a supply chain of auto production between the United States and Mexico. Likewise, concluding trade agreements that cover ICT products with trusted partners would help incentivize the creation of trusted supply chains among those countries.
That is a very good point. We have some questions we haven't had a chance to answer, but we are bumping up against the hour, and I just want to give the final word to Rob and then Chris to round us out. So I guess the final question I would have is, this is about sort of making a difference, getting things into legislation, making changes. This is a very ambitious agenda, not least because it sort of brings together security and economy in a very sort of significant way. Rob, Chris, with that in mind, what is the sort of one measure from the recommendations that you think is most important to take forward? Maybe Rob first and then Chris.
I think you're on mute, Rob.
I think you're on, yes.
Thanks, Sam. From where I sit, the first step is developing a strategy. We have a myriad of different initiatives going on in the U.S. government, some of which are funded, some of which are legally or legislatively mandated, and then a bunch of stuff going on in the private sector. And we need to do a sort of solid audit of what's going on, identify where there's tension, identify where things are pulling in opposite directions, where they're working together, and weave all this together into a broader strategic approach. And part of that involves sort of identifying leadership leadership on that front.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, so I would add to that collective action. I don't think that this is something that can be done unilaterally, either by industry or a particular government. Therefore, it needs private, public, collective action in the broadest possible context, international. I would observe, as I think we all have, the problem will not solve itself. Market forces alone aren't going to take us to the right corner. And I think, as Lindsay so thoughtfully pointed out, this is about more than technology itself. It's about economic vitality. It's about resilience of critical functions, and it's about influence that these systems provide to citizens. Whether that's appropriate or inappropriate is ultimately determined by what's in the supply chain. We need to think our way through that based upon the values of the like-minded nations who are going to take this on.
Thank you very much. And I think with that, I want to thank you, Chris, thank Rob, Sam, Lindsay for some very thought-provoking comments. I do commend everybody to check out the Solarium Commission's white paper. I think a link to that has been put in the chat. This is very definitely not the last time that we're going to be discussing this issue, and I look forward to ongoing discussions. But for now, thank you very much, and all the best. Take care.
Thanks.